Good afternoon. My name is Joanna Dowling. I'm a historian and writer local to the Chicago area, and I've been researching interstate highway rest areas and other non-commercial roadside spaces since 2006. Welcome to Along the Way, Midwest Waysides and Rest Areas. This is a road trip that's going to take us to the places we stop when we're on our way to somewhere else. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the unique and kitschy designs that have become associated with early highway travel, most notably Route 66. Places like motels in the shape of a big teepee or service stations that mimic quaint neighborhood cottages. You're also likely familiar with the more modern designs that began appearing on American highway roadsides following the Second World War. Iconic mid-century mainstays like Howard Johnson's and the Holiday Inn. But these are not the places we're going to be visiting today. Today, we're going to be visiting places you have also likely stopped at, but never logged on your map. The place where you might dash from the car to run in to use the restroom, take the dog for a quick walk, or eat that picnic lunch packed before heading out in the morning. They're also places where we can seek a respite, stretch our legs, read a historical account, or take in something of the scenic natural landscape. Today we'll be visiting some of the Midwest's most notable and iconic waysides, roadside parks, and rest areas. Places so ubiquitous we seem not to notice how important they have become. We begin our journey here at the Chamberlain Rest Area on I-90 in South Dakota. South Dakota's rest areas are significant because they're both typical and atypical of the rapid rest area development that accompanied interstate highway construction in the 1960s and 70s. They include both practical amenities and what has become recognized as historically and nationally significant public sculpture. They embody something of a reflection on the past with a vision toward the future. So we'll be returning to South Dakota shortly, but first, let's take a look at what these roadside amenities actually are and how they came to be. They are familiar to all of us who have a lust for the road, those modest blue signs that simply read, Rest Area. Whether we consider them welcome or not, in most parts of the country, highway miles can be measured by the distances between them. They are a fixture of the road. They exist because of the road alone. These places, remote, sometimes forgotten, sometimes avoided, were once the promise of a new transportation system, intended to be the connection between travelers and the places they traveled through. Beneath their sidewalks and picnic tables, they bear a story of cultural significance that millions of Americans have experienced. As the story goes, the first roadside park in the nation was established in the spring of 1929 along a rural stretch of Michigan Highway. Apparently, Alan Williams, a young highway engineer, had witnessed a family trying to eat a picnic lunch from a large stump covered with a white tablecloth along the side of a highway during the previous summer. Before the season was over, William had witnessed the scene a number of times and decided that Michigan travelers should be provided some kind of roadside amenity that would make their experience more pleasurable. During the winter months, Mr. Williams put idle snowplow crews to work, knocking together tables from scrap lumber and painting them an attractive green. And the following spring, the state put out their first roadside table on Route 16. Roadside parking areas would not exist without the road, and the history of the road is inherently connected to the development of the machines that traversed it. At the turn of the 20th century, there was less than 150 miles of paved road in the United States, serving an approximate 33,000 motorized vehicles. In 1900, there were no interstate highways, no state highways. There were no improved routes of any kind that traversed and connected long distances, connecting the nation, which made travel across the vast western states particularly challenging in an automobile. Additionally, local roads were famously muddy and nearly impossible to traverse depending on weather conditions and the time of year. The growing dependability of the automobile was dramatically thwarted by the lack of reliable travel routes. Americans were eager to use their autos to travel distances farther and farther from home. To be able to do so, they needed good roads. During the first decades of the 20th century, road building was slow to keep up with the nation's rapid production of automobiles. However, bolstered during this period by the Good Roads movement, private road building enterprises, such as the Lincoln Highway, and the initial construction of scenic highways in a number of national parks, and the engineering achievement of Oregon's Columbia River Highway and the scenic Columbia River Gorge, meant the value of road construction gradually gained traction with the federal government. That momentum would culminate in 1919 with the crossing of the first transcontinental Army motor convoy. The now famed expedition consisted of 81 motorized Army vehicles that crossed the United States from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco, a distance of 3,200 miles, in 62 days. It is a common conception that the interstate highway system was a sole product of post-war modern America. However, it had its seeds in the Roosevelt administration of the 1930s, and even earlier as President Eisenhower, whose name the system famously bears, was prompted early in his military career to take an interest in transportation when he served as a member of the 1919 convoy. The challenges they faced in crossing the country on a patchwork of mediocre roads that were often muddy and sometimes treacherous resulted in 230 road incidents, including breakdowns, accidents, and recovering vehicles from poor travel conditions. The experience would stay with Eisenhower for decades and inspire him as president in the 1950s to champion the interstate cause. The findings of the 1919 convoy led directly to the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1921. The landmark legislation provided for the creation of a formally designated system of primary highways. The act served as the first sweeping federal support for national-scale road construction, with an emphasis on long-distance routes. The project resulted in a system of numbered designated state highways, of which Route 66 became famed. During the 2 decades following the completion of highway construction, roadside park construction exploded. In combination with the growing production of automobiles, the construction of improved roads meant that Americans began enjoying a personal mobility unprecedented in human history. The prosperity of the 1920s saw Americans enjoying a new life of leisure, which included travel on their new system of highways that would take them virtually anywhere in the nation. As the luster of the 1920s gave way to the Depression of the 1930s, New Deal relief programs continued to give life and creative ingenuity to roadside park construction. A section of Highway 100 in the area of Minneapolis, Minnesota, showcased a series of roadside parks that featured the stone and rough-hewn wood construction that was also being employed by the WPA and many of the nation's national parks. The sites exemplified many of the features that had become standard, including picnic areas, barbecue grills, walking paths or hiking trails, where available, scenic overlooks and historic markers. Also, rustic landscaping was employed. They were also unique in their inclusion of less typical features, including waterways and their famed beehive fireplaces. A number of these historic features have been saved and restored through local preservation efforts. In addition to the typical features, which most often did not include running water or flush toilets, scenic site selection was a primary consideration in all parts of the country. Roadside parks were cited with a twofold objective: to introduce travelers to the most attractive areas of a state, and in an effort to anticipate where spontaneous stopping was likely to occur. Following the Second World War, Americans who had gained a renewed sense of personal and financial freedom continued their desire to take to the road, and thus began the era of the Great American Road Trip. By the time the nation was ready and in need of a vastly more modern network of highways after the war, Roadside parks had made a place for themselves in the hearts of American travelers. They had become an expected, if not necessary, fixture of American highways. The interstate highway system was first conceived of in the late 1930s, but did not come to fruition until the mid-1950s, with the passage of the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. It was officially described by the American Association of State Highway Officials in the following manner. The national system of interstate and defense highways, more commonly known as the interstate system, is a 41,000-mile key network of modern freeways, spanning the nation. There were three primary considerations that cemented the inclusion of rest areas in the interstate system. Of primary consideration was public expectation. The traveling public had come to expect and rely upon the provision of off-road spaces, and it was recognized that those expectations would carry on to the new system. Secondly, one of the main features of the new system, and a dramatic change from what had been typical to traditional highways, was the standardization of limited access, meaning that all entering and exiting of the road would be made by what are now familiar on and off ramps. The interstate system would have no cross traffic. These ramps would be located at intervals, which would dramatically limit a driver's ability to leave the roadway. Additionally, it would be considered unsafe and illegal for drivers to stop on the highway shoulder, except in emergency. Finally, the highways were designed to bypass existing towns and would, particularly in the western part of the country, run across vast stretches of undeveloped countryside. Rest areas were needed to take the place to some measure of the main streets and roadside businesses and roadside parks that had offered drivers respite from the road during previous decades. A major change that came with the interstate era was the strict standardization of highways and highway features. Rest areas were subject to this in the same manner as all the rest. In 1959, the Federal Highway Administration issued a policy on safety rest areas for the national system of interstate and defense highways. The publication outlined in detail how and where safety rest areas were to be constructed on the interstate system. The earliest guidelines were strict and bare. They provided guidance on the distancing of sites, the nature of entrance and egress ramps, how many parking spaces should be provided, how to choose site locations, and the nature of the structures that should be included. The policy did not encourage creativity or developments that expanded the sites beyond the basic guidelines. However, it wasn't very long before bare standardization gave way to creative ingenuity. In 1961, the American Association of State Transportation Officials produced modern designs for toilet buildings. The visual guide offered design and plan ideas for 7 different building types, which evolved and ultimately manifested over the next 2 decades into 4 primary categories of design, schemes that clearly mimicked the prominent design trends of the era. Rest area design began in the late 1950s with modest structures that closely reflected the rustic designs that had become standard before the war. The dawn of the 1960s saw a modern aesthetic that slowly morphed into regionally and historically inspired schemes. And finally, the 1970s saw an increase in scale of sites and buildings and a design aesthetic as funky as the decade itself. Rustic. Rustic-type buildings and shelters most closely expressed the link between roadside parks and rest areas. Built primarily in the late 1950s, their forms reflect the rustic aesthetic of previous decades. They are most notably defined by their functionality and adherence to the minimal mandates of early standardization. Rustic-style buildings were modest in scale and traditional in building form, exhibiting hipped or gabled roofs. Very few traditional-style buildings survive today. Wisconsin, however, offers an exception, where one can visit a first-generation comfort building that is now used as a maintenance building within an expanded and updated site. Modern. By the early 1960s, the mid-century modern design aesthetic that was dominating commercial and domestic architecture was becoming manifest in rest area design. The design of buildings and structures in this vein was an attempt to mimic in simplified form and material, high-style, modern aesthetic. By this time, rest areas were no longer the rustic roadside parks of previous decades. They were modern sites serving a modern transportation system and a modern way of life. Modern design reflected this ideology. In Illinois, South Dakota, and Kentucky, architectural firms were commissioned to create architectural designs for rest area locations. This, too, was an effort to recognize and further establish the growing prominence of the new transportation system. Modern-style buildings were most often characterized by flat, low, rising roof lines, modest in size, and minimal in detailing. A few unique examples featured butterfly, scalloped, and sawtooth detailing. They were accompanied by modern-style shelters and also by regional-style shelters, often those that utilized the programmatic design strategies that were so common in the early designs of commercial roadside businesses. The Illinois State Toll Highway Commission was established in 1953. The first 3 toll highways in the Chicago area opened 5 years later in 1958. The Jane Addams Memorial segment between Devon Avenue and Elgin was the first to celebrate its opening on August 20th of that year. Today, the Toll Authority operates nearly 300 miles of tollway in more than 10 counties in northern Illinois. The system is a staple to all of us who call Chicagoland home. And since we are discussing roadside amenities, we would be remiss not to give some attention to our famed over-the-road Waysides. By the mid-1950s, the effort to expand and streamline the transportation system was also being revealed in the architectural design of the buildings that were serving roadway travelers. The purely vernacular kitsch designs of the early diners and motels had given way to a more streamlined, modern aesthetic. Oases are defined as a type of service plaza found along toll-charging interstate or regional highways. And like other rest stops, these oases are full service. Federal regulations forbid commercial development at rest areas on toll-free interstates. Only toll roads can offer commercial services to the public within the highway right-of-way. These amenities typically include gas stations, restaurants, and other novelty or gift shops. The Lincoln Oasis was the 6th erected, constructed in 1967 and designed by architect David Hyde. It was a modern glass and steel structure, an unmistakable nod to famed Chicago architect Mies van der Rohe. Both the one-story glass and steel restaurant building and the service stations were built using maintenance-free steel that was engineered to turn a rich, dark brown as it weathered. And of course, for a time, the Oases were home to Howard Johnson's, one of the most recognizable roadside installations of the mid-20th century. Through the 1940s and 50s, Howard Johnson's purchased the operation rights to run the service station restaurants along many of the nation's limited access roadways. Their colonial design theme was popular in many states in the eastern region of the United States. This design was recognizable and welcoming to travelers who came to depend on the sense of home-style sameness that they could experience while traveling between regions or states. Howard Johnson's was a staple on limited access roads. They represent the first institutional and design phase of restaurant service stations along these routes. In Chicagoland, they adapted their image to the over-the-road building type. Beyond being a mere reprieve for weary travelers, the Oases became a recognized symbol of travel through the Chicago area as the only system of over-the-road service plazas in the United States. And for a time, they also served as a kind of local destination, providing not only an escape from the road, but a respite from the congestion of urban life. Regional and historical. Connection, sense of place, the meeting of expectations, communication. The popular quip laments, that the interstate system made it possible to drive from one end of the country to the other without seeing anything. Partially by accident and partially by design, rest areas became the antidote to this. As the only quick and easy places to leave and return to the road, they were often the only locations drive-through travelers made actual contact with a state. In many places, this is still true. In the late 1960s, one Department of Transportation engineer went so far as to call rest areas state ambassadors, places where it was possible to make a connection with drivers, to communicate with them the identity of the place they were passing through. While it is true that this communication was often based on regional caricatures and expectation, an effort to meet travelers' expectations, it is also true that these efforts were made in a genuine attempt to capture a tangible sensibility that would, at least in part, compensate for the real connection to place that was lost through the transformation of the transportation system. In 1968, Robert Jacobson of the Nebraska Department of Transportation reflected this regarding the state's rest areas. We feel that the most appropriate means of impressing the public with the value of the highway beautification program is by developing quality rest areas, something they can see and use. Each safety rest area is considered individually to engage its development to reflect and express dominant topographical, historical, archaeological, geological, architectural, or biological features in the area's proximity. Since the restroom building and information center has the highest usage, this facility is cited to be immediately recognizable and available to the motorist. The picnic tables and shelters are designed to create a pleasant exterior environment by using varying planes oriented to give maximum protection from the elements and to direct the occupant's view toward points of interest. The unity of each safety rest area is emphasized and enforced through the character of all structures and the continuity of material use. Each area is developed with a park-like atmosphere bounded by indigenous flora. In 2017, the Rapid City Journal named the Chamberlain Rest Area one of the 5 most scenic places to visit in southeastern South Dakota. The site is situated on high bluffs overlooking the Missouri River, providing an expansive view of the waterway and the surrounding landscape. It is a rest area hallmark to offer a historical or cultural reference point, often in the form of a few descriptive panels. But the Chamberlain site is particularly unique in the depth of cultural reflection it has come to offer. It was here, more than 200 years ago, that Meriwether Lewis and William Clark stood and surveyed the landscape that stretched out before them. It was here, more than 150 years after their passage, that Ward Whitwam's teepee structures sought to broaden the conventional narrative of South Dakota's settlement history. And it was also here, in 2016, that the Dignity of Earth and Sky, a 50-foot-high sculpture of a Native American woman, her arms outstretched, her back draped in a quilt of mosaic blue tiles, was erected, welcoming all who approach her. She is both a commemoration and an outreach, representing inclusion and strength, a contemporary companion to the image Whitwam created over a half a century before. In 1968, architect Ward Whitwam was commissioned by South Dakota to create a scheme for the state's new rest areas. The objective given him was to tell a story through site design that would tangibly orient people in the history and culture of South Dakota. His idea was simple but poignant: reflect the cultural past that most expectantly defined the state, Native culture and European settlement. His design was straightforward, and it reflected the minimalist aesthetic that dominated the era. 2 site pairs were originally commissioned. 5 more would follow in the 1970s. In each of them, a 30-foot-tall concrete lodgepole structure would stand in the form of a Native American teepee. The forms were made of 8 precast concrete lodge poles, each one weighing 6.5 tons. They were set into place and notched together, creating an oculus near the top and a wide base at the bottom of each. The sculptures would stand adjacent to a modest comfort building designed to mimic the form of a settlement dugout or sod-roofed dwelling. If you drive the length of Interstate 90 through South Dakota, you will encounter 5 sites that are home to Ward Whitwam's concrete interstate teepees. This is the name they were officially designated when they were listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 2015. In a gesture that seems appropriate to the intention of their original conception, the sites are now considered of historic significance themselves. They are the only rest area features in the nation listed on the National Register. They are recognized for historical significance within the transportation system and for their design and construction. Rest areas were designed to be redesigned. Their spaces first and foremost intended to serve a functional purpose. Aesthetic considerations, while thought essential, have always been and remain secondary to services. Many rest areas across the nation are now an amalgamation of original design intent and updated services. Modest shelters stand near scaled-up new buildings. There are sites where nothing remains but the location, as well as those almost perfectly intact to their original construction. In South Dakota, the original sod-roofed buildings were replaced by more contemporary buildings. Some of those are now being replaced as well. But Whitwam's collection of teepee structures has remained intact, a tangible representation of the layering of history and story that is quite literally marked on the South Dakota landscape. Iowa's first-generation rest areas were constructed in the mid-1960s. They followed the trend that was typical in most states, being constructed in conjunction with the completion of segments of interstate highway. As the highways opened, the rest areas were ready to serve its travelers. The buildings were designed in a simple, modern vernacular style, featuring brick and timber construction and accompanied by picnic tables and minimal wooden structures, and in some locations, octagonal welcome centers. The sites served Iowa's interstate system for over 30 years. In the late 1990s, the state commissioned regional design firms to complete the design for 19 second-generation rest area sites. In little more than a decade, the site completed the construction of a complete redevelopment of its rest areas that reflected both well and lesser-known stories in Iowa's history and culture. The themes include wind farming, artist Grant Wood, Lewis and Clark's Corps of Discovery, celebrating transportation, the Underground Railroad in Iowa, Iowa literature, and agriculture. Iowa's use of regional imagery in its development of a comprehensive system of second-generation sites is exemplary of the idealism that drove the use of regionalism during the initial era of rest area development. However, Iowa's contemporary initiative reflects an expanded understanding of how regional imagery and storytelling can be used to create more comprehensive conversations around the matters of history and culture. The 1970s. As the decade of the 1970s dawned, rest area development was gaining new momentum from the recent passage of the Highway Beautification Act of 1968, which created new initiatives and funding for the development and beautification of roadside spaces. The decade saw this enthusiasm manifest in the creation of expanded forms and enlarged spaces. First-generation development continued through the late 1970s, by which time most states had completed the majority of their initial interstate construction. As the decade progressed, rest area development took on a progressive and ever more creative tact, and programs such as the one described earlier in Nebraska saw them as a means of serving the public good. Creative developers continued to design shelters in forms that drew on regional imagery, such as teepees, oil rigs, and windmills. Buildings and sites grew in scale to accommodate increasing traffic volumes on the interstates and took on non-traditional forms and engaged visitors by capitalizing on the assets of the local landscape. As the need for more elaborate facilities grew, architectural design was enhanced to showcase the structural presence of buildings. Rest area designers wanted to create a comprehensive experience for the stopping traveler, one that was restful, aesthetic, and perhaps even educational. They created a legacy of sites that are truly a reflection of 20th century transportation progress. Nebraska has a long and layered history as a North American travel route. Native trails, European immigrant trails, the crossing of the first transcontinental railroad, and in the early 20th century, the Lincoln Highway, the nation's first continuous cross-country roadway. In 1974, Nebraska's segment of I-80 was completed from border to border, making it the first state in the nation to complete its mainline interstate highway system. The state's original rest area features were decidedly modern, minimal flat, planed brick structures that mimicked and intermingled with the expansive landscape. In 1973, just 1 year before the completion of I-80 across the state, talks began regarding the commemoration of the nation's upcoming bicentennial in 1976. What emerged was a plan to commission a series of large-scale public sculptures that would be installed in the rest areas located on I-80 in Nebraska. There was precedence here, as works of art had begun finding residence in rest areas in the 1960s, used as a way of attracting the attention of motorists as they approached, and as a form of amusement and/or education once inside. Originally dubbed the I-80 Bicentennial Sculpture Project, and eventually known as Nebraska's 500-mile sculpture garden, the purpose of the project was to celebrate the nation's bicentennial by providing access to examples of outstanding contemporary sculpture and to contribute to Nebraska's cultural heritage. The sculptures were developed under the theme Horizons, meant to inspire thoughts toward the future of America and reflect on its past. Although the primary purpose of rest areas has always been a functional one, they also serve as places that locate us in particular landscapes and very often share offerings that help us interpret and relate to those places. The Nebraska Sculpture Project sought to communicate a reflection on place based on the ideal of contemporary abstract form. 8 sculptures, commissioned through a nationwide design competition, were dedicated in 1976, all of which still stand today. The Nebraska Wind Sculpture by artist George Baker, located at Kearney, westbound. The Memorial to the American Bandshell by artist Richard Field, Platte River, eastbound. Crossing the Plains by artist Bradford Graves, York, westbound. Up, Over by artist Linda Howard, Ogallala, westbound. Nebraska, Gateway by artist Anthony Padonvo, Bradley, westbound. Irma's Desire by artist John Raimondi, Grand Island, eastbound. Roadway Confluence by artist Hans van de Bovenkamp, Sydney, westbound. Arrival by artist Paul von Ringelheim, Blue River, eastbound. Today, roadside rest areas possess little recognition in the forefront of our cultural mind. They are generally considered functional locations, serving a utilitarian purpose. They have not made the nostalgic jump into our cultural landscape that other roadside amenities such as diners and motels have achieved. Rest areas, in contrast, have blended into the mundane landscape of the roadway itself. The functionality of these locales has overshadowed their historical and aesthetic implications, leaving them to a wonderfully anonymous and terribly practical history. Ironically, this speaks to the true success of these roadside spaces. They have so effectively served their useful purpose that they have subordinated to their own historical significance. However, functionality is only a single aspect of the rest area story. The diversity of their characteristics speaks to their true significance. They are in their essence cultural landscapes that possess a rich and varied design progression and a history that cannot be separated from the development of our 20th century transportation system. The culture of their use, however under-recognized, bears as much national memory as our more touted roadside features. Their history is one that should be recorded as significant, both in terms of 20th century architecture and social experience. There is nothing more practical in the end than the preservation of beauty. The first roadside beautification movement began in the 1930s as a concise effort to preserve as well as showcase the varied scenic qualities of each state's unique landscape. Nearly a century later, we continue to manage the same issues that provoked its founding, namely, the balance between progressive development and the preservation of the scenic and natural landscape. Although they are no longer the primary roadside amenity on our nation's highways, roadside parks continue to hold a silent space where this balance can be sought. Their spaces remain more intimate than those of interstate rest areas, their rights of way closer to the land, their experience a deeper reminder of what we seek at the heart of every journey. This is everything that is meaningful and powerful in any place that offers connection, an invitation to step beyond ourselves into a space inhabited by others. If the invitation is successful, we will return to ourselves and our journey with a deeper and renewed appreciation for everything that surrounds us. This is the value of stopping by the side of the road. This is Joanna Dowling. Thank you for joining me today for Along the Way, Midwest Waysides and Rest Areas. If you're interested in more information about rest area history, you can visit my website, and that's www.restareahistory.org.